Good morning. This morning I'm going to be talking to you about the Old Testament historical books. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about how the Old Testament historical books are different than the other books in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament. I'm going to do that this morning by looking at this through three different kind of categories or lenses. First, I'm going to talk about the theological themes and subject matter of the histories versus the other books. The differences in the process of interpreting the historical books, and then finally discussing how they can be applied to Christian life today. It's fitting to start by defining historiography. Eugene Merrill, in Cracking Old Testament Codes, writes, "Historiography is the recollection and recounting of persons, movements, and ideas that made a difference then and whose impact may still be felt." So even in Merrill's definition of historiography, he implies that these books are useful even for today. First, let's look at the theological themes and subject matter. Eugene Merrill also points out, and I think this is important, that history is primarily national. It's not as familial or tribal as I think in Christianity today we often like to make our faith. We talk a lot about our personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and that's good, and we don't want to discourage that, but the histories are different in that they really focus on the entire community of Israel. It's about them rather than a specific group or a specific tribe. The history in the Old Testament is characterized by a God who acts through the representation, oftentimes, of prophets and kings, right? In the histories, we see very much Elijah and Elisha, as well as Saul and David, these kings and these prophets that God is representing himself through. Very much different than like a Pauline epistle, for example, where Paul is saying, hey, yes, I'm God's representative, but here's what he teaches you, here's what I'm teaching you. God is very much at the forefront, whereas in the histories, he's oftentimes, especially in the narrative forms, behind the scenes, and in some cases, not even mentioned at all. Garrett Kell, who's a pastor in Virginia, I think provides a helpful guideline to theological themes throughout the Bible. He writes an article for the Gospel Coalition, and fittingly it's called Every Book of the Bible in One Word. And the reason I bring this up is because I think his breakdown of the Bible helps us to kind of understand what sets the histories apart from the other books. So for some examples, in the Pentateuch, some of the words he uses are promise, power, preparation. It's this big theological theme in the Pentateuch that God is covenantal, that God is setting forth covenants to be with his people. In the wisdom books, some of the words he uses are pain, praise, and purpose. There's this theological theme of God's personhood or worthiness to be praised or ability to be known. That's kind of the theme, theological subject matter of the wisdom books. The prophets and the epistles, some of the words Kell uses is holiness, sovereignty, judgment. These texts encompass the theological themes of God's different characteristics. And then the Gospels and Acts, some of the words he uses, or phrases rather, are God of the Jews, God of the Romans, and God of the world. These texts reveal God's love and purpose for all people. And then this brings us to the histories. The histories are very much about kingship, about God being the king, about God being the only good king ultimately. We read in the Judges that the Israelites wanted a leader, and God said, you don't need one, but he gives it because they keep asking, and those judges fail. And then he brings in Saul, and he backs Saul, but then Saul fails. And then he puts in David, and he backs David. And David has many successes, but he also has many failures. And then Kings shows us all these dozens of kings who just do not live up to the messianic promises that God was making, that a royal king would come. And we, of course, know now that that king is Jesus Christ. This brings us to the next category that I want to discuss, and that's the process of interpreting the historical books. V. Phillips Long writes, "It is one thing to believe the Bible is true, It is another thing to understand what it says. So what Long is doing in The Art of Biblical History is he's saying we can believe the histories are true, but we have to understand its purpose and what it's actually trying to communicate and say. And this really comes down to genre. Phillips Long writes, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel can be described at one level as predominantly narrative discourse, at another perhaps as royal apology, and still another as a composition containing stories, sayings, proverbs, poems, songs, battle reports, genealogies, prayer, and prophecies. It's not always clear in the histories what genre we're reading. Long writes, just as the physical world does not present itself in such a way that no creative choices are required of artists who would depict some aspect of it, so the past does not prevent intel in such a way that historians need make no creative choices in the construction of the historical account or some aspect of it. In other words, it's important that we slow down and try to discover the purpose of the author, not just focus on the recorded historical facts. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about applying this to the Christian life. An example of this is in 2 Samuel. It appears that the author in many ways abandons a desire for chronological sequence in order to exemplify King David. He's not as worried about this is what happened in order. He's worried about his purpose being accomplished, and that's showing David as the Davidic king that will bring glory to Israel's God. The last thing I want to hit on this morning is how we can apply the historical books to the modern Christian life and how the applications might be different than the applications in other parts of the Bible. You know, as I mentioned earlier, the epistles give you a very straightforward Paul or Peter saying, this is what you ought to do, right? The Gospels, Jesus says, this is what you ought to do. The law of Moses says, this is what you ought to do. The historical books require much more interpretation to gather what it is that we ought to do with the text today. Besides just being a history, how can we also apply it? I think Merrill's guidelines for interpretation that he lays out in his article in Cracking Old Testament Codes is helpful for this. He lists out 7 guidelines for interpretation, and we're running out of time, so we won't go through all of these, but he really touches on things like, first, how do we apply the context? Just last week in this course, we talked about finding the geographical, political, religious, and social context of the history of the text. We need to understand the scope of what's going on there in order to apply it today in 2018. We also must remember that the historical record is only that. It's a record. It's not the event itself. We have to remember that we're filtering this through a different language, thousands of years, in an entirely different context.